Today's show is sponsored by Do It. Cloud spend is just the surface. What really matters is how it drives performance, reliability, and speed to market. Do It Cloud Intelligence aligns every dollar to the intent of the workloads. Do It is trusted by companies like Fiverr, HackerRank, Current, and Superbet. Do It helps teams go beyond dashboards, surfacing hidden inefficiencies, resolving incidents faster, and aligning cloud operations with business priorities. One platform, unified signals, better outcomes across engineering and finance. Visit doit.com, that's DOIT.com, to unlock intent-aware FinOps at scale. Do It Cloud Intelligence.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. August 2025 is upon us. The sort of last real month of summer. I think everybody's starting to, probably get a little antsy. It's a little bit hot. The kids are, starting to think about going back to school. They probably don't want to go back to school, but you'd like to get them out of the house. Anyways, it's my dog's birthday, so happy birthday to her. Another weekend perspective. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to talk today about kind of one of the most difficult transitions that any company has, especially a new company that comes into a market, begins to establish themselves in a marketplace, and disrupts the incumbents, disrupts a marketplace, does some things that people had never seen before, and kind of chew through all of the early part of a market. They get through the trough of disillusionment, they cross the chasm, all of the things. And they begin to, have expectations. The world has expectations of them. Maybe they become a public company. Maybe they become a very successful public company. And at some point in time, their mantra of being the disruptor begins to fade away, because not only do they, no longer have, astronomical growth, rocketing up into the right growth anymore, but they begin to have, nice growth. They begin to have manageable growth that is, interesting, but not overwhelming. It's not something that necessarily makes headlines anymore. And they begin to have to figure out how to, still want to be the young, hot superstar kid that they were early in the days. And they move into middle age. They begin to move into a stage in which they, they have to just, be reliable, be dependable, be accountable for, just having a good, steady, 15, 16% per quarter, per year growth company, as opposed to the rocket ship maybe they were before. So today we're going to talk about that transition, that sort of, maybe becoming sort of a hybrid, innovative, stable company that, transitioned from, maybe what you might call a day one to day two type of company. We're going to dig into that after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Vasion Print. Technology should drive your business, not slow it down. But legacy print systems are a resource suck. Don't waste time and money managing print when there's a solution. Vasion Print, formerly known as Printer Logic. Eliminate resource-intensive print servers and make the switch to an intuitive, cloud-native solution that makes printing effortless for IT teams and end users. Reduce attack surfaces and secure your environment while enjoying cloud-native flexibility that's easily supported in a hybrid workforce. It's not a patch or a fix. It's a truly seamless solution for print. See for yourself by scheduling a demo at vasion.com. That's VASION.com. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dig a little bit into, kind of the real challenge, sort of the second big challenge that any company has beyond, figuring out a great idea, turning that into a company, turning it into a profitable company, becoming, an exciting startup, a rocket ship of a startup, something that people aspire to that sort of transitional period in which the rocket ship starts to plateau, starts to even out, starts to find its orbit, but has to, continue on. People still have expectations for you. They still want their packages delivered the next day. They still want their storage to be kept forever, those types of things. And what I want to talk about a little bit is the latest earnings from Amazon. I know we've been talking a lot about AI in the last months and so forth, a lot of weekend perspectives about AI, but I want to talk about cloud today. And I want to talk about cloud in the context of Amazon Web Services. And I'll begin by kind of thinking back on stuff I get a chance during my day job to to evaluate a lot of companies, to do a bunch of things like building keynotes and other stuff. And some of the things I like to do is go look at other companies and see how they're doing, see what theirs look like. And I actually went back and looked at an old keynote. I went back and looked at like a 2017-ish or so keynote from VMware. We were just kind of looking at how they did message building and framing and so forth. And that happened to be the year in which Pat Gelsinger invited Andy Jassy, then CEO of Amazon Web Services, onto stage because they were going to announce a partnership in which VMware was going to launch a public cloud service, a managed VMware service in the AWS cloud. Pat spent 20 or 30 minutes talking about hybrid cloud and having on-prem and public cloud resources and hybrid cloud or multi-cloud. I forget exactly the way he framed it. And Andy came out and of course did the CEO to CEO handshake thing, and they were both very excited to bring great things to customers and to their partners and so forth. And Andy, Pat would talk for a little bit and then Andy would talk. It wasn't just a sort of giving up the stage. They both were on stage, and Pat would talk about hybrid cloud. And Andy would immediately, he wouldn't correct him, but he was very quick to always call it on premises. There was no concept of cloud that wasn't in the AWS cloud, right? AWS was the cloud in Andy's world, and anything that wasn't AWS, especially if it was, private cloud, public, on premises in your data center, was always on premises. There wasn't even mention of the word cloud. And the concept of hybrid didn't exist at all. And the reason I use that as a beginning of our kickoff today, as sort of the lead in, is I think Amazon and maybe in particular Amazon Web Services. Sometimes we just call it Amazon, but obviously those are two different things. But I believe Amazon Web Services is entering their hybrid phase, or as Andy would reluctantly never want to say, or Jeff Bezos would never want to say, I feel like they're really entering their day 2 phase. And I say that in the context of, I want to kind of begin, Amazon just had their earnings. They announced earnings, I believe, on July 25th, 2025. So we are recording this a few days later. We are recording this in early August. But they announced their earnings numbers, and it was fine. Amazon Web Services grew somewhere between 17 and 18%. Amazon Web Services has grown. If I went back and looked at the last 10 quarters, they grew 17%, 17.5%. And I'm going to kind of go in reverse order: 17%, 13%, 12%. That's when Matt Geimerman started. Prior to that, they grew 19%, 16%, 13%, 12%, 12%, and 16%. That is the last 10 quarters going back to sort of Q1 of 2023. Nice numbers, right? Nice numbers, nice double-digit numbers. Similar to, say, like what Red Hat has grown, right? A company who, has done very well, but you may not necessarily consider them to be, the rocket ship that you once thought that AWS was. They're nice numbers. But they're not keeping up with their competitors anymore. They're not keeping up with Azure. They're not keeping up with GCP anymore. And I kind of went through and it kind of made me wonder, because people were, kind of questioning their numbers. And again, they're doing very, very well. They're well above $100 billion in annual revenue. I mean, it's hard to believe that, for as many people dismissed Amazon Web Services, that there's no way that thing's going to take off. I mean, they defined a marketplace. They defined public cloud. And they defined, the place where startups would run their workloads. And they began to be a place where enterprises would begin to put their things. Although Andy was, pointed out, hey, there's still 85% or so, maybe more, that's still on premises in that non-cloud world. But it did get me thinking, now that it's been 10 quarters, at least 10 quarters now, in which Amazon hasn't grown 20%. In fact, if you go back and look, and I put some links in the show notes, ever since Andy left, that last quarter that he was there, or maybe I think it was the quarter after Andy was announced as CEO of Amazon, so one quarter beyond when he left, they grew 40%. And that was the peak. That was the last time they had grown at that rate. And ever since then, their growth quarter over quarter, year over year, has been down from that. And there's a good chart that's in the show notes. You can click a link on the link. But essentially the last couple of years, so we're now, coming up on the third year of sort of generative AI, right? The moment of generative AI when ChatGPT came out in October, I believe September 2022. It's almost 3 years into that. And I kind of wonder, and I'm going to kind of postulate something. And again, this is not a knock on AWS. Again, AWS is a fantastic business. It is the most profitable business at Amazon. It is the one that throws off the most profits. It's not the biggest, but it throws off the most profits. It is the like I said, the most profitable. I do sort of wonder, has AWS missed the generative AI transformation? And I don't throw that out lightly, right? There are, one of the most difficult things for any incumbent leader of any industry to do is to not just survive, but remain in the same position or a similar position to where they were in the previous era of technology, right? And I go back through and I think about, I like to be sort of a historian sometimes on this show. IBM thought computing would need to be vertical forever, right? The model that they had built in which they managed both the hardware and the software and the services and all that sort of stuff. And in essence, that sort of mindset, that mainframe mindset that had made them so successful, the number one computing company in the entire world, they basically missed the PC thing. Microsoft thought mobile needed to be like the PC, right? It needed to have an operating system, that didn't necessarily think about things like power and cooling, had access to all of the applications that you were used to in your computing experience. And essentially they missed mobile. Search engines thought the internet needed to be a portal, just like AOL, the previous sort of internet had been. And things like Yahoo, missed search and essentially missed the Google era of distributed computing, right? Apple today thinks AI needs to be vertically integrated. In essence, they're sort of missing AI. And I feel like, and I'm going to point to a whole bunch of things. None of this is sort of speculation. I'm going to point to a bunch of things and let people make their own decisions. But it does very much feel like Amazon Web Services thinks that generative AI, or just this sort of new world of AI, will just be another building block, another thing that just is sort of part of the tool chest that builders have, right? And I think you could sort of argue at this point right now that they're missing the generative AI world. And whether or not people believe in the generative AI stuff, whether or not it turns out to be as transformational as a lot of people are pointing to, whether it is just another sort of feature, just like a SQL database or serverless or any other types of thing to be seen. But I sort of made a list of this because the reason I highlight all this stuff is I think Amazon's in an interesting situation. Actually, let me go through these things, and then I want to kind of come around to this hybrid thing. Actually, let me postulate the hybrid thing. All right, so I've already sort of talked about, it has AWS missed the generative AI transformation, and I'm going to kind of go through why I think maybe that's the case. And again, I'll make the counter case, or at least I'll highlight the counter case that Andy Jassy made in the latest earnings calls. But the reason I bring this up is Amazon Web Services has been a fantastic company, fantastic, first ballot Hall of Famer. We joke all the time. I mean, just an amazing company. Defined the cloud, redefined the cloud, redefined what it meant to have partnerships with people like Intel and AMD, and then, to build your own technology to replace those types of technologies, right? Building their own Graviton ARM-based things that were 30 and 40% cheaper, and all these sort of wonderful things. Built their own networking to deal with the kind of scale they had. Built their own storage system. I mean, unbelievable type of stuff. But everything very much CPU based, mostly CPU based, right? CPU, ARM, right? So not GPU based. And the reason I bring all that stuff up is I think they're going through their hybrid phase. And why I say that is this. Amazon Web Services is now up to 18% of Amazon's revenue, right? Nearly 20%, nearly $1 in $5 that comes into Amazon, like the largest retailer, maybe beyond Walmart, but the internet's largest retailer. $1 in $5 of theirs now comes from AWS. And those dollars that come in, those 18%, nearly 20%, are the most profitable dollars. that Amazon makes, right? And so it is a incredibly important business for Amazon to begin to fund or to begin to backstop a lot of other things that they do, whether it's retail or advertising or transportation or healthcare or a million other things that go on there. The importance of that AWS profitability is incredibly important to the broader set of Amazon, right? Not that, Amazon necessarily treats their businesses like that. I think they say they manage them somewhat independently as building blocks, but AWS is really, really important, right? And it's been an interesting part of the business, but now it's really, really important. And the challenge with AWS is because it is the most profitable, it makes it incredibly important, right? And when you become incredibly important, and you become that big a part of your business, and this isn't specific to Amazon, this is specific to every single type of business. When you become that important, and the rest of the business relies on you, but just as importantly, the stock market, the level, the value of your stock price depends on that. It makes you become less willing to take risks. Because the requirement to maintain a level of where you are, to perform at a certain level, that trade-off between sort of certainty and stability and risk averse and being able to go out and do a whole bunch of crazy things and try a whole bunch of things, the experimentation that AWS sort of built their whole business on, are now kind of at odds, right? You've got AWS growth has sort of plateaued over the last 10 quarters, right? Like I said, they have not had a quarter over 17%, 19%. They had not had a 20% quarter in 10 quarters, 2.5 years. We've seen Azure and GCP have been growing 1.5 to 2x what their numbers have looked like over the last at least year, right? And a lot of that's driven by AI. And so the challenge that Amazon and AWS now have is, in order for Amazon, which forever has paid their employees based on stock compensation, they've been the darling of Wall Street. They have been able to do a lot of the things that they do because their stock price allows them to sort of play around with things as far as how they invest and so forth. It does feel like AWS is now at a point where the dreaded day two, the thing that they fear the most, that they don't want to talk about the most, is now a big part of what they have to deal with, which is they need the GPU-based part of Amazon Web Services to generate a ton of cash. And that means that, when Andy Jassy takes questions from Wall Street, like he did this last week, and there's a link to the transcript in there. There's a question in there at some point where an analyst asks Andy about their AI strategy, and are they struggling with it? And Andy sort of walks through a bunch of stuff, and we'll kind of get into the details of that. But one of the things he really highlights is that there is still a ton of legacy applications that are in data centers, not cloud, in data centers, that can be moved to the cloud. And the way he sort of frames it is almost as if that opportunity is bigger than the AI opportunity. And maybe it is. It probably is. Who knows, right? It depends on where you're accounting for your trillions of dollars of spend, right? But the point of all that is those are two very difficult things to sort of manage, right? Like forever, Amazon was always about, we're doing things the new way. Amazon Web Services. We're doing things the new way. We are not doing things the way that your legacy ways of doing things in the data center are. And I think what they're now up against is they are going to have to sort of deal with day one of AI, whatever generative AI becomes, and they're going to have to deal with day two of the massive challenge of trying to transition legacy data center stuff into the cloud. And the low-hanging fruit is gone. It is all gone for the most part, except for maybe 20%, growing 16%, 13%, 12%, whatever that is. But when they still talk about, 80, 85% of it still in your data center, it's there for a reason. It's there because it's already been cost optimized. It's there because it has weird firewall rules. It's there because it is legacy stuff that doesn't need to be optimized or modernized or put against scale out computing or put into a microservice. It just is, right? So it'll be a very interesting thing. Every company really struggles with that transition between how do I do the new stuff, the things that go fast, the things that I experiment, the things that I have to break, and the stuff that just has to churn. You have to optimize process around. You have to make the numbers every quarter. You can't be sloppy about it. You can't experiment. It has to be as reliable as the train schedules in Switzerland, right? And so I think it's going to be an interesting thing. And I want to come back to that's my reason for the whole concept of this is I think AWS is going to go through and is going through that transition. And I think how they manage that transition is going to be really interesting for the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think this is a 1 year sort of thing. Let's see how they do. Right? This is a 5 to 10 year thing. And the other really hard part about this is Amazon, when they were creating the cloud, when AWS was creating the cloud, everything they did was wow. Everything they did was, this is new. We are changing how scale out storage is built, right? We are going to give you API access to infrastructure. We are going to allow you to do on-demand pricing. We're going to allow you to buy things for an hour. We're going to allow you to just all sorts of things that they did. I mean, every AWS reInvent was a masterclass in innovation, right? They defined what cloud computing looks like. They're not doing that at all in AI. And I'm going to highlight a few things. And again, people can take that as an opinion. It's not intended to be an opinion. I think if you asked most people around AI, where does AWS fit in terms of you think they are defining things that are going to be the standard? I don't think they're in many of those conversations right now. So let me highlight a few things. Number one, we talked about this a couple of times on previous shows. They're not investing in GPUs, at least leading edge GPUs, i.e. like NVIDIA GPUs, at the same rate as their cloud market share. But every other large provider is, right? So if you have 20% market share, you have 20% of the NVIDIA GPU market. We talked about how, previously they were about 20 percentage points below where their market share was and where they had invested in GPUs. And I know they're trying to make that up with their own training chips, and they're kind of, trying to fill that in. But their level of investment in AI has been behind, right? They don't have a top 5 Frontier LLM, right? You can point to some of the new things that they talked about at the last reInvent, but it's not considered a top 5 Frontier LLM, right? Yes, there are a lot of things available in Bedrock. You can get, all the other major LLMs in Bedrock, but none of them are necessarily perceived as being things that are owned by Amazon or driven by AWS. They don't have a productivity suite to attach AI to. They don't have an Office 365. They don't have a Google suite, right? That they can now just send you a bill and go, oh, you're starting to use those AI features, whether they were Copilot or Gemini or something. We've now just raised your bill, right? They don't have an attachment to a productivity suite that they can touch, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of enterprises and now charge them an extra $4 per seat, $10 per seat, right? There's no low hanging fruit that AWS has necessarily grabbed from an AI perspective that are the initial use cases for productivity for workers, right? That Microsoft and Google both already have. They don't have a leading coding assistant application. They don't, yes, they have some investment and some partnerships with like Anthropic, but they don't own one, right? They're not Cursor. They're not Windsurf. They're not Claude. They're not Copilot. They're not any of those things. And so, from a builder perspective, if you go, hey, we cater to builders, they don't own any of the tools. They're not monetizing any of the tools unless, it's behind the scenes. And again, they don't own one of the leading models. For coding assistants, for builders. They don't have an immediate acquisition target that's going to fix this for them, right? There was a lot of talk for a while that they seem to be kind of aligning themselves to Anthropic. I know they've made some investments around Anthropic. Anthropic's now talking about a valuation of $150 billion. That's probably not an acquisition that AWS is necessarily going to make. Maybe they will, right? They've got $200 and some odd billion in cash flow available to them, but probably not necessarily an acquisition level that they're going to make, right? Some of these valuations are getting kind of out of hand. And the last thing I'll point out, and again, these are all just factual things, right? This isn't, Brian's perspective on anything. This, they're not yet breaking out their AWS, or they're not breaking out their AI revenues, right? There isn't the bravado that we saw previously with AWS, in which they always touted out where they stood on the Gartner Magic Quadrant. They're not talking about how many new customers are using AWS. In fact, I looked through the transcript. They don't mention any, right? Andy says, "Oh, there's a bunch of them," or "There's some," but doesn't mention any names. I mean, he used to rattle off names as if it was like, the kids' names, right? They're not rattling off numbers. They're not talking about the number of tokens they created that like Microsoft is doing, or that Google is doing. They're not talking about the number of GPUs they have in their clusters. They're not breaking out anything about their AI revenues, in which they always used to as a showcase of dominance, as a place of bravado, right? And so, you look at all those things and you go, as of right now, it feels like they would argue back in the day when people were talking about cloud, that if somebody didn't do those types of things, right? Level of GPU investment, ownership of a frontier model, do you have an attachment for low-hanging fruit, monetizable things? Do you have a coding assistant? Again, do you have a leading tool in this space? Do you have a plan for acquisition to fill in the gaps that you have, i.e. what we've seen with Mark Zuckerberg hiring engineers, or OpenAI buying companies, or whatever that might be, or you're breaking out your AI revenues as others have done. They've always been transparent about what their revenues were in the cloud space. They're not doing that in the AI space, right? And I look at all those things and I go, those are characteristics of a company that you would say is not necessarily in the same vein, right? That we talk about them as a hyperscaler for cloud. They're not in the same ballpark from an AI perspective. And what's the most concerning is, Andy was asked about this on the latest earnings call. And, again, Matt Garman's not on the thing. They're not asking, Andy sort of right now is the face of AI, and really still the face of AWS because of this. Somebody asked him, where do you think you are? And Andy's argument for where they are, and again, this is opinion. People can think it was a good answer or a bad answer or whatever. He basically said a couple of things. He says, number one, we're still in early innings. We're in very, very early innings, and that's fair, right? I think if you go to most enterprises and you say, how far along are you? They're still really early, more POCs than they have things in production. Have they figured out corporate standards? No, not yet. Have they allocated? Do they know what their budget should look like for AI? No, not necessarily, right? Like I think it's that part of it is fair, that the enterprise is still well behind sort of where consumers are, just putting in their credit card or using the free versions of, ChatGPT and other variants of that. Fair. But what was very interesting was his answer would have never held up to Andy Jassy's scrutiny for how people should look at, how companies should look at the cloud. His argument was, we're big in the cloud. We will have a whole bunch of services. What you do today should just be an add-on to what you do. Your applications are here in the AWS cloud, or your data is here in the AWS cloud. We have lots of things. Therefore, we should win. That was essentially his thing. It was, the same way that we think about building blocks for cloud services, for database, for storage, for networking, for firewall, for whatever, is the same way we think about Gen AI. And, his other thing was, well, the way that you do things today, we have the largest cloud, therefore we should be the leaders in AI, I think misses a couple of points. And it might end up being true 5 years from now, right? Like the patterns that have now sort of been established for enterprise cloud may end up becoming recurring patterns. But I think for right now, it's not necessarily the case. I think for right now, people are putting money into AI things that they can immediately see some sort of return for, right? So the builderness, the building block approach for AI, again, might pan itself out in several years. But right now, people are like, I want to see what AI can do. And I want something that I can kind of immediately get a sense of, does this meet some expectations I have? Like, I need to establish a baseline of what my expectations are. And this is why we're seeing something like ChatGPT taking off so much. You can just begin using it. So the exact same thing, the exact same pattern that made AWS successful, I want a server, I want it right now. I don't want to go through a long procurement process. I don't want to have to think about putting a bunch of pieces together myself. I just want it right now. I want to see if it'll work right now. I want to experiment with it and see if it works. Is not necessarily the approach that is going on with AWS, right? Their approach is sort of, well, you need to sort of, use these steps. You need to use these 7 or 8 things and put them all together and piece them together and have the right hardware with the right software, with the right tooling, with the right agent framework, feels very what they would consider like old school IT, legacy IT, as opposed to the cloud. Now, experiment, play around with things, turn it on, turn it off. The other thing I think that his assumption is sort of making, and again, this is the challenge of becoming the new standard in business, and then something new comes along and tries to disrupt you, is very much the premise or the idea that what we do today will be what you'll do tomorrow. And I think that's questionable. I think, what we saw, the reason that the cloud took off, part of it was because there was a ton of money that got pumped into the market by VCs, and VCs didn't want you building your own data centers, and Amazon was there at the time to go, here, build with us right now, right? And you can do it on demand. But the second part of it was they grew, especially in the enterprise, because of shadow IT. Shadow IT said, I got a project. I got a business project I need done, and I can't wait for the internal IT team to get that done. I'm going to go to the public cloud. And for the longest time, AWS was shadow IT. They were the home of shadow IT. They were the number one sponsor of Shadow IT Con, right? And Andy's premise now is no. That idea of going around things, of breaking the rules, of doing things different, isn't going to apply to Gen AI. The way that Gen AI is going to be successful is you're going to use the muscles that you've built up here. And it's an interesting place. It's an interesting perspective, because it's in essence, the argument that people used to make about, well, this is why cloud will never take off, because it doesn't do all the things that legacy IT does. It doesn't understand all the challenges of it. It doesn't, and the laundry list of stuff. And Andy's approach and AWS approach has been, we're going to do the same thing with Gen AI that we did with cloud. And while you go, oh, well, cloud was the new thing, but it's not that way anymore, right? AI is very much a show me something now technology, at least the phase we are in right now, which is exactly what cloud was 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting to watch. I'll kind of wrap it up, and now I've been going for a long time. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch how AWS manages this transition. I'll call it their hybrid phase. Maybe we should call it the day 1 to day 2 phase, right? But I think it's more of a hybrid phase. How can they go after the 80 to 85% on-premises stuff that Andy says is not yet in their cloud? Huge amount of IT spend that isn't necessarily low-hanging fruit, that don't necessarily be easy to move into the cloud, but if they can, is high margin business for them, high volume, high margin business, versus having to also manage this new transition of Gen AI, in which, like I said, they are behind. Maybe they're going to catch up. It does feel like at this point they've sort of missed the boat, right? They've missed the most important things. And to be able to do both those things at the same time, right? We've seen Amazon, try and shift everything they do, every talking point they have to be generative AI. The last couple of reinvents have essentially been everything Gen AI. How do they now manage both those things? How do they manage continuing to grow, their high margin CPU-based business, which is the highest margin within Amazon, the largest revenue generator within Amazon, but at the same time, also have the muscles, also have the focus, also have the prioritization to do this Gen AI stuff in which they're not the leader. They don't get the benefit of the doubt. Their competition is not sleeping at the wheel as they saw happen with the first cloud. And I think this handling of day one and day two, or maybe even day three, this hybrid phase that they're now in, that is their worst nightmare to think about the concept of things don't center around them. It is a hybrid of how people think about stuff, or a hybrid about where people are doing things. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. And I think it's going to be one of the biggest stories from a cloud perspective over the next 5 to 10 years, because it will have an impact on, whether people continue to stay in the AWS cloud, or whether they the AI spending drags them into other clouds. It's going to impact how AWS partners with companies who, for the last 10 plus years, they've sort of looked down upon, companies that have large footholds in the enterprise and data centers, whether it's an IBM or an Oracle or a Broadcom with VMware or a Palo Alto or Cisco or whoever. If they want to find ways to move those workloads and do it in a way that they don't kind of totally displace those legacy technologies. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how they prioritize these things now that AWS itself has become such a huge part of their business, such a huge part of what their stock price looks like, and how so many people at Amazon are compensated. I think this is a new era for them, and I'm not. I'm never been one to say bet against Amazon. I think Amazon's a fantastic company. I think they've proven themselves the ability to transition in and out of markets and to think about things differently and so forth. But I think this is probably for the first time a very, very big change in how Amazon Web Services has to think about themselves, both in the bigger context of where they sit in the company, but also how do we operate from behind? Because at this point, they're not ahead in generative AI. Are they still ahead in cloud? Absolutely. The CPU part of cloud. But the GPU part of cloud, I don't think they are. I don't think the numbers necessarily hold up to it. I don't think the technology necessarily holds up to that argument. And this is one of the first times I think they've ever sort of been behind in the market that they created, for cloud/AI services. And it's going to be fantastic to see. Fantastically interesting to see, how they adapt to this. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop there. Been going for a long time. Gosh, I've been going for 33 minutes in this little rant, or this little overview. But I think it's an interesting thing to watch. We'll set the timer on day two now is, August of 2025, and we'll see how the day two transition, the hybrid phase transition, goes for AWS. It will be very, very interesting to watch. Maybe it is, even the phase two of the Cloudcast, what we cover. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for telling a friend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.